We've heard a lot about beauty tonight, the theme being exponential beauty. It's a really tricky topic. I'm a philosopher as well, and I can tell you that volumes have been written on the topic of beauty. But there's one saying about beauty that I think everyone knows. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think everyone would probably agree with it. I certainly agree with it. It's an excellent saying, and it holds true. But what people don't know about beauty is that there's a second saying that is equally as important and potentially more universal. And that's that unless you're alive, it's impossible to experience beauty. I will be talking about life extension science today, because for me, being alive is the most beautiful thing on the planet. All around us, through our speakers today, when you walk out this room, when you get in your cars, when you fly, wherever you go and travel, you're going to find beauty. Everyone's interpretation is completely different. Everyone's idea of it is their own. But ultimately, all those interpretations are going to be completely true. Some people find a skyline that's reflected off water the most beautiful thing. Some people find helping strangers the most beautiful thing. Some people find driving a fancy sports car on an isolated highway at 100 miles per hour a very beautiful thing. And some people find just art beautiful. It really does differ. But ultimately, no matter what your version of beauty is, you have to be alive to experience it. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about my personal story, and then get into a little bit more about the beauty of being alive. When I was 21, I began a sail trip around the world on a small boat, and it was an extraordinary journey. I have traveled to over 100 countries and seen some incredible things. This is me sailing off Papua New Guinea with an active volcano in the city of Rabaul. But along the way, I became a journalist. Worked for most of the top media companies out there and did some incredible things. I invented the sport of volcano boarding. It's one of the weird things that sort of follows me around. Instead of snowboarding, you use a sandboard essentially to go down an erupting volcano. And ultimately, the sport was born. And what makes the sport fascinating is there are lava bombs flying above you. Just one of my journalistic endeavors. But I've done other things too, including covering the Iberian Links and stuff like that. One of the more important things I've done is done a bunch of conflict reporting where there was war zones I've covered. The one I did a documentary on was the Pakistan-Indian Kashmir conflict, incredibly dangerous. But no journalistic endeavor I did was more dangerous than my coverage of bomb diggers in Vietnam. And so I want to tell you the most beautiful moment that I have ever had. During the Vietnam War, America dropped millions and millions of tons of bombs on Vietnam. And you may not know this, but a few percentage of those bombs never exploded, as is always the case when dropping bombs. And as a result, what you have is a huge amount of unexploded bombs littering the jungles, the rainforests, and basically the entire area that had been bombed. And naturally, that's a huge amount of metal. And what's been happening in Vietnam, at least in the last 10, 15 years, and I went there as a journalist to cover this story, is that farmers have been giving up farming, literally walking away from their rice paddies to go into the jungles every single day and look for these unexploded bombs, because the metal is so much more valuable than their rice farming could ever be. Most of the rice farmers there live on about $1 or $2 a day. If you find a bomb, maybe a 6-foot or 8-foot bomb, you will ultimately maybe get a couple $100, a year's worth of salary. So a lot of the young farmers in the area have left their farming and then gone on to do the bomb digging. Now, the problem with the bomb digging is that the countryside is filled with landmines, absolutely filled, especially along the demilitarized zone where most of the bombs are. So I, as a journalist, was covering a lot of these bomb diggers, and every single day I'd wake up at dawn and walk out with them from their village and walk up to the mountains and cover it. And I can tell you that every single day doing this was one of the most nerve-wracking days of my life, mostly because you're worrying literally every step that you're going to step on a landmine. And naturally, you have tons of people that have done it. This is one who did it, but he survived. Most people do not survive stepping on a landmine. But the most beautiful moment of my life occurred when, on my final day of filming, I ventured off the trail about 3 feet, and from behind me, I felt this jolt of energy. Somebody came and tackled me. Turned out my guide had ran and just literally tackled me. My video camera, my backpack, everything. We went flying onto the ground. All the bomb diggers I was with started shouting. Apparently, I was just about to step on a half-buried landmine. You could just see it. Later, we brushed it aside. But while laying there on the ground, I had the discovery of a lifetime, or perhaps the revelation. I like to call it a philosophical nuclear bomb, because at that moment I realized that for a couple of years I've been doing some incredibly dangerous things, but the most dangerous thing in the world had just happened to me. And what I wanted to realize about the entire process was that I was ready to give up my journalism, ready to give up the danger in order to join a field that is interested in preserving life. I realized at that moment that I wanted to overcome death and not die. When you're that close to death, or you've had that kind of experience, something really sinks into you emotionally. And that was the moment that did. And for that reason, that moment is the most beautiful in my life. It's certainly the most memorable. We live in a culture of death. Everywhere around us, the human race has basically been conditioned to accept it. But around the world, there are now hundreds, thousands of scientists working on life extension medicine, and the field is growing so fast, you would not believe some of the technologies. A few years ago, they were able to reverse aging in mice. Already, they're doing some incredible other stuff. Broadly, we call this field life extension science, longevity research. I like to call it transhumanism, which means basically going beyond human. But whatever it is, the field of science, the field of medicine, the field of radical technology is very dramatically changing the way we all live. And there are many, I can look in this room, I can tell you many people in this room will probably never face death if the scientists continue at the rate that they're going with developing life extension technology. And for me, that's a very wonderful thing. Now think about that for a moment. If you really knew you weren't going to die, it can change one's perspective quite dramatically. Everywhere around the world now, there are people developing incredible medicines, incredible technologies, and most of it is directly just to keeping us alive, making us live better, making us healthier. I just did a story on robotic hearts. Maybe many of you have known, but France just did its second robotic heart surgery. I predict that within 10 years, a robotic heart is going to be better than a human heart. In fact, it's going to be better than the heart of an Olympian. So think about that. If we all have a robotic heart disease, the #1 killer in the world, could be eliminated. That in itself can radically change the way the species lives, the way the species can do things. It eliminates at least most of the deaths from heart disease. But it's not just, things like surgery. It's other things that life extension technology are changing. I don't know if you realize this, but wheelchair companies are basically going out of business. Everywhere around the world, exoskeleton technology is allowing handicapped people to get out of their wheelchairs and start walking. These companies, they've been around for a long time. It's a billion-dollar industry. They're going the way of the dinosaurs. And this is a classic kind of technology, a classic modern science idea that is changing the way people look at the world and making it really much better. There's no longer you get in a car accident and you're confined as a paraplegic or quadriplegic to a wheelchair. There's now this opportunity for everyone to put on this exoskeleton technology and to have it lift you right out of your seat so that you can do anything you want. And in 5 years, that technology is going to allow you to run faster than a human without the technology. Now, some people will say all this technology is not good. They'll say it goes against the grain of society. They'll say it defeats philosophical ideas that civilization has had for hundreds and hundreds of years. But ultimately, I find death and I find aging perhaps the most ugly things in the world. Ultimately, I think aging and becoming old, sick, watching your loved ones, your kids die, this is a very sad thing. It's something that we can all overcome. And so I find it quite ugly and the exact opposite of beauty. Which brings me to who I find the most beautiful people in the world are. And naturally, as you probably suspect, they are life extension scientists, they are doctors, they are the technologists and engineers out there that are working to bring us the technologies to allow us to live longer and better. All around the world, there are people literally in this, I work with them all the time, covering them in my articles and talking with them in my stories. They are doing the most remarkable types of things you're going to see. For example, Alzheimer's. They're now putting chips in people. 5 million Americans have Alzheimer's and probably 50 million worldwide. And they have a chip now where they can put it inside your head and will restore your memory. It's the future. And it's the kind of thing where instead of having people fall off a cliff at the end of their life, forget who they are, and their family members have to take care of them, there's now a way around that. Which brings me to my wife, who I consider one of the most beautiful people in the world. She is a OBGYN and had studied for 20 years practicing to do what she did. But what I want to tell you about is her experience in Mombasa. Mombasa is the legendary city in Kenya, and she went there as a doctor and worked in some of the state-funded hospitals. Now, if any of you have been to Africa, you know that most state-funded hospitals have very little resources, and their level of care is dramatically different than we might have here in Europe or in America or in the Western world. In fact, many people die from basic diseases. Part of the reason they die is because they don't have access to antibiotics and they don't have access to medicines. One of the touching stories that when I asked my wife what one of the most beautiful experiences of her life was she told me that a 16-year-old had come in and she had had an infection from a miscarriage that she had just had. And unfortunately, she came in completely alone, had no family, no resources, and no money. And while they will accept people into the hospital, if they can't actually, the hospital is not allowed in certain cases to give them medication if no one is there to pay for it. So this young teenager was going to die. And my wife walked outside, went across the street, and bought all the antibiotics that she needed. Now, the thing about this hospital is that dozens and dozens of doctors are doing the exact same thing to keep people alive, to make them so that they get basic things that will ensure. This is just a simple getting an antibiotic. It's a $15 thing to make someone live. But in places in the world, they're not even having that. So there's a huge amount of unnecessary deaths. But I wanted to mention her because I do find these kind of cases and find her incredibly beautiful. For anyone that wants to dedicate themselves to keeping people alive, moving us all forward, it's all part of a big giant picture. Which brings me towards the end of the speech. And now I'm going to put some wild thoughts in there as I talk more about some of the stuff that I often write about. The future of beauty is something that is going to change dramatically from what it is now. For example, I was just talking to some leading scientists who are working on brainwave technology, and essentially they're able to download certain ideas of yours into a computer just using your brainwaves. Now imagine for a second, and this kind of technology already exists, the mindware, and there are some headsets out there that already can read your brainwaves. In fact, just 3 months ago, a Harvard University team had a person in India send hello and ciao to a person in France, and they were able to communicate with no verbal renderings at all. It was just one person thinking to another person. The foot is already in the door for us finding the technology to download our entire set of memories, our entire, anything you want to recite. We might be at TEDx events in 10, 15 years, and it will be all in our heads, just tied to chips. You won't have to show up, and it'll be the exact same experience. Because reading your brainwaves is the same thing as actually saying a word out loud. It's just a neural process. But that will really change our definition of beauty. Imagine for a second if all of a sudden we are in virtual worlds. What is beauty? Is a second life beauty? Will we see something completely different? What if we're tied into a computer system that has computing power that's potentially 100 times what it is now? Or as some experts say, in 25 to 50 years, it could be 1,000,000 times. There'll be skyscrapers filled with servers like this. This will be what your brain will be tied into. What will beauty be like then? Will it be something that's still so tangible as we know it now? Or will it be something totally different? Most people don't know this, but the human eye only sees about 1% of the light spectrum. The human ear hears about 0.01% of what's out there in the sound waves. So imagine for a second if we're actually tied into devices that allow us to experience that other 99%. It makes you think a lot about how beauty, not just beauty, but how everything is going to change. Ultimately, we live on a planet that is a few billion years old. We've evolved from a place of tiny little cellular organisms, and ultimately we've developed this mind, this mammalian mind, that can talk to each other, see each other, reason with each other, and then also can do abstract things like create amazing pieces of art. But ultimately, we're just an infant in what the universe is. And when we start applying technology like life extension and robotics and microchips into our head and start tying ourselves to a digital world, we're going to find ourselves discovering entire new concepts of beauty, entire new arenas of it. It probably wouldn't be something we would even recognize today. And a lot of this is just 5, 10, 15, and 20 years out there. So I'll leave you with my final thoughts, which is I stand in awe of the universe, which is approximately 13.6 billion years old. And ultimately, it's so unfathomable to think of that distance. And yet, as soon as we are able to get into a digital world and start seeing some of the possibilities that are going to take place, we're going to have a much greater chance of examining the universe as it is. Artificial intelligence will help us understand physics. There'll be things happening in biochemistry, and there'll be things happening in biotechnology with us becoming cyborgs. We'll be tying ourselves into whole different apparatuses as a human species. In fact, we will no longer be the human species. We'll be something very, very different. However, whatever happens, no matter how far we go, no matter how far we evolve, one thing is going to remain constant. And that's what I wanted to leave you with tonight, is that beauty requires us being alive. And so I hope if everyone just walks out here and thinks about it, the life extension industry and advocating for ideas of living longer, advocating for ideas of changing the culture of death is very important to get our governments and just society to realize that the human species, the human being is not a coffin. The human being is something that is designed and can be able to live forever.